Hello and welcome once again. In this final video, we are going to pull everything together. So by now you have normalized your data. So you started in that Excel spreadsheet, which originally this was the data that I provided to you. You've gone through the first, second, and third normal form normalization process, and you've come up with something that looks like this. You've also gone into MySQL Workbench and then created those tables. So we have a clothing table, we have a clothing price table, and we have the clothing colors table. Well, in this final video, we are going to now work in PHP and HTML and generate some SQL queries that call out this data and form the necessary relationships between these tables to display all of the content in one document. So let's go to Dreamweaver or a web editor of your choice. We're going to do a file new. We're going to select the PHP option just simply because it's going to start color coding things for us right away. I'm going to do a file save as immediately. I'm going to go out into the folder that I've called lab 10, and I'm going to call this file clothing.php. The first thing that we need to do is copy some of the data that we used in lab 9 that is allowing us to connect to our database. So I'm going to go open up the lab 9 file that I created, and once I'm there, I'm going to open up the contact list. That was the file we worked on last week, and I need to take this initial stuff. So in my case, it's lines 1 through 10, and I'm just going to copy that. I'm going to come back over to my clothing.php, and before the opening of my HTML, I am going to go in and paste this content, and then I'm going to close that PHP. So if you remember, what I'm doing here is I'm doing that require once to get my DB connect. We'll take care of that here in a moment. Then I have my variable, which is $CON, which is short for connect, and then we pass through the variables for our server name, our username, password, and the database name, and then we run a check to see if it's working. Well, the first thing that it's doing here is it's requiring this DB connect file. So I need to make sure that it is in my lab 10 folder as well. So I'm going to save this file, and then I'm going to go move that over. So I'm going out to my desktop. I am going to now locate, here's my class 9. This was my code from last time. Here is that DB connect file. I am making a copy of it and bringing that copy over to my lab 10 folder. So now I have the clothing.php and the DB connect in that folder. That's very important. We don't have to do anything to change this DB connect file. It just needs to be there because we are calling it out by using that require once statement right here. So we have this in place. Now, if you're using something other than Dreamweaver, you'll need to type in the opening and closing HTML content. So that includes this doc type, the HTML, the head, and then our opening and closing body tags and the closing HTML. Once that is in place, we all should go in and label our web page and put in a new title. So I am going to call this one Clothing Lab 10. Once I have this, I'm going to save it. We are now going to move in between the body tags, and the first thing that we are going to do is we are going to add an H1, and this H1 is just simply to give our page a title so we know what to expect. I am simply going to call this one, similar to our title up above, Clothing Lab 10. Notice this is still in just regular HTML. After this, I need to go in and open up my PHP, and just in good practice, I am going to close my PHP. For what we are doing next, we will be working in between the opening and closing PHP. And the very first thing we need to do is we're going to start working on selecting our data. So we are going to be using that select statement that was talked about in the earlier videos that is a SQL query to select the data that we want. So I'm going to open this up by creating a variable. So this will be very similar to last week's lab, and I'm just going to call this SQL. And because it's a variable, we've got the equal sign and then the quotation marks. We're going to use select, which is exactly what it means. It just means select the data. Now notice it's in all caps. This isn't necessarily a requirement, but it is something that we do out of common practice so we can identify the actual SQL commands and know that they are different than the columns or table names that we are including here. Now it's important to remember I'm going to put in each of the column names that we're going to want to display data. So if we look at our database really quick, we will see that we have color. We want to look at the colors, that we have price and tax, and we have an item. Notice I'm not paying attention to those ID columns yet. They will come into play, but not quite yet. So we're going to list out each of these column names exactly as they appear. So the first one I'm just going to start with is item. We're going to separate them each with commas. We're going to come back to these in a moment and put in what are referred to as aliases, but for right now, let's just put these all in. And we know that they're all on different tables. That is when we're going to be incorporating the joins that were talked about in the earlier videos. But for right now, we just need to say these are all of the columns that we want to pull data from so that we can display them. We're going to say where we want the data to come from. And in this case, we are going to start with the table called clothing. And just so that we know what we're doing here and what this whole SQL command is doing, I'm going to go back and I'm going to put in a comment. So we do that with the 2 forward slashes, and I'm going to put pull item, color, price, tax from the database. This is what this whole set of SQL variable commands are going to be doing. As I mentioned, item, color, price, and tax are not all in the clothing table. So what we need to do is first, we're going to add some aliases. Now, aliases just help us use kind of a shortcut to identifying what table particular information is coming from. Before we actually go in and create these aliases, we're going to make some comments and create kind of a key. So I'm going to make some more comments, and we are going to say alias C is the clothing table. So we're just telling ourselves what this letter C is going to stand for because we're going to be using this. So then alias P is the clothing price table. And because I like to usually just use 1, 2, maybe 3 letters, I've already used the C for clothing. So I'm going to use COL for color is the clothing color table. So that's our key. Now we need to go in and apply these aliases. So the first thing we need to do is actually designate that this C is indeed for the clothing table. And we do that by going to the end of this line and after clothing, typing in the words as C. So now it's saying select item, color, price, tax from the table called clothing, which is being represented as a C. But now we need to go back and indicate that not all of these columns are found in the same table. Instead, let's go in and see which tables they are and apply the appropriate letters. I'm going to go over to my SQL Workbench. I'm going to start with the clothing table, and it is item. So I'm going to go in front of item and put a C and a period. So what this is telling me is that the item column is in the C table or the clothing table. So let's go back to MySQL Workbench and take a look at one of our other tables. I selected clothing price, and I can see that we have price and tax are our 2 columns here. So let's go add a P in front of each of these. So P period price and P period tax. And that leaves our last one, which is the clothing color table. So let's again go back and and look, find that, and I just noticed that this is called clothing colors. That's going to be really important. It's not just color, it's colors. Anyway, we have one column here and it is called color. So I'm just going to make a note up here. This one isn't so important because it's inside of a comment, but it will help me as we move forward. So here's my color, and I'm going to put a COL period in front of this. So this is our first line of code. And at the end of this, I'm going to put a space because what we're going to do next is we're going to concatenate or join in the next line of code. We could type this as one really big, long line of code, but it's actually easier to read if we see it in these shorter chunks. In order to make sure that our letters and our words are not squished together, I need to put a space here. And then it's my quotation mark, and I'm going to finish the line with a semicolon, just like I normally would. Now, to finish this concatenation, what we need to do is we're going to use the exact same variable as up above, but instead of just equals, we're going to use a period and an equal sign. Because if you remember from last week when we concatenated, or even just here up above, this line right here, this quotation mark and period is a concatenation. So this period indicates that we are concatenating or joining this line of code together. After the equal sign here, we are going to put our quotation marks, and this is where we're going to be joining in our tables, because as we said, item is the only column that's actually located in the clothing table. So this time we need to figure out how we are going to join in these three columns. What we need to use is the command, in this case, inner join. Look back to the videos if you don't remember exactly what inner join is doing, and we need to pick another one of the tables to join in. And in this case, I am picking clothing underscore colors. Make sure I got that S in there. And now I need to specify its alias. And so I'm saying colors as COL. So this is how it knows that this COL means it's pulling from this table. But now we need to say, what's it joining on? It needs a way to match so that the particular elements, so the price or the color, match with the particular item. In this case, I am going to say on, so we're going to inner join this table on, and then we have to find something that matches. And this is where those IDs and these foreign keys come into place. So I'm going to go back to my SQL workbench, and we're going to start with our clothing table. Well, we know that the only two ID columns here are clothing ID and price ID. So we're going to keep those in mind, and we're going to go over to the clothing colors table and see if any of those match. So I'm clicking on clothing colors, and if you remember, we had clothing ID and price ID. Well, clothing ID is the only one in here, and so that's a common column between these two tables. So that's what we're going to use to join them together and make this connection. So this is where we use our aliases. We're going to join the clothing ID column from the colors table to the clothing ID column from the original clothing table. Now I'm going to put a space after this line. At the very end, I'm going to put my semicolon, and we're going to start a new line, and we're going to do it the same way. We're going to concatenate this one in as well because we need to get that last table in. So there's my period, my equal sign, I'm opening my quotation marks, and we are going to use an inner join again. And now the only table that's left is this clothing price table. So that's what we are going to join in. So it's going to be clothing underscore price, at least because that's what my tables are named. As we designated this in our key, we said we were going to be using P, and then we have to link it on something again. So we're going to go look at our clothing price table, and we have price ID. It's the only ID that's here, but we're linking it into our clothing table again. So we have clothing ID and price ID. So this tells me price ID is the column we are going to be using. So again, we're going to do P for the clothing price table, and we're going to use price ID as the column, and it equals C, or again, clothing table and the price ID column there. This in and of itself is now going to pull all of this data. But if you remember right, we had a couple more things that we need to do before we actually can get this data to show up. First, I'm going to put my semicolon here. Next, we're going to go down and do the first of those. And that was we needed to create a result variable. And this result variable then was going to call up one of the predefined PHP functions, in this case called MySQL_query, and it is going to query then our database using that information. So we need to call the connection, which is up above, and we need to separate with a comma. We're going to actually query this whole select statement right here. So that is our result. Just like anytime we go and make this kind of query, we need to check and see if it worked. So just like how we tried to do with our connection up here, we run to see if it connected, and if not, we kill the process. If you remember right, just like last week, we need to do that here as well. So we're going to do an if statement, and we're going to say if no $result. In other words, if it can't find a result for this particular query, and that is our conditional, then die or kill the process and then display this error. We're going to concatenate and put in the error. So we've got the colon. See, I've already got a second quotation mark. So I'm going to go after that, put my period, do my SQL I_error, and my parentheses. And at the end of that line, I am going to put in my semicolon. That's what's going to happen if it can't find any results. Well, what if it can find results? So we're going to go in and do an else statement. So I've got my opening and closing curly brackets, and inside of this else statement is where we need to run our while loop, the loop that's going to go through all of the results from our database and display them on the page. So inside of this else statement, we need to create our while loop. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So while, and in this case, again, we're just going to use $item equals, and here's that predefined PHP function called MySQL I_fetch array, and we wanted to make an array out of the result. Now we need to open our while loop, and I'm going to close my while loop right away and give it a comment so I know what that closing curly bracket is for. So this closes the while loop, and while I'm at it, I am going to make a comment and state that this closes the else statement, just so I know what they're for. Now, in between these curly brackets is where I'm going to echo out the results. And in this case, so we're going to echo in quotation marks. We're going to start up a paragraph, and we want to do similar to what we did with the contact list last week, but this time we're going to display our item, and underneath it, we're going to put our color. Underneath that, we're going to put price, and underneath that, we're going to put the tax. So we're going to start out with this paragraph and just go clothing item, colon, and we need to do a bunch of concatenation because we are pulling in each of these variable items. So I just put a space after my colon, and there's my quotation marks. I'm going to move to the other side of that, put a period, do $item because it's what matches this variable right here, and then the square brackets, and inside the square brackets I need to put in the column name, and in this case it's item. It's the same as right up here. I'm going to concatenate out, and I'm going to put a line break here and not just a full paragraph. I'm not ready to close this line, so even though Dreamweaver has put this quotation mark in there, I'm not ready to use it. And just for the ease of being able to see what we're doing, I'm going to click return or enter on my computer and tab in a little bit and start typing my next line. And in this case, I'm going to do color, a colon, and a space. And now we need to concatenate again so we can use that quotation mark that's been kind of floating along with us. So I'm going to do the period and a space, $item again, square brackets, and this time we want color. So if we look up here, we can see our column name is color. So let's go put that in here. Now we can concatenate out. And again, we'll do this and we'll do a line break. Just like before, I'm going to go underneath and we're going to do price this time. So colon and end the part that's displaying, and then go in and concatenate in our next, which is price. So $item again, square brackets, the single quotes, and what is our price? It is simply that, price. That's our price column. Let's concatenate out, do another line break, and this will be our last line, and this will be our tax, because that's the last of the things that we want to display. So I'm going to go on the other side of my quotes again, put a period, $item. I think, and I hope, that you're getting the idea of what we need to put in here to get these things to display. Now let's concatenate out, and instead of a line break here, we are going to close our paragraph, and this is the end. So let's go after our quotation marks and put our semicolon. So that is the end of our echo statement. Let's go test our results. So I saved this document. I'm going to go out to FileZilla. Okay, out on FileZilla, I need to locate on the left-hand side my Lab 10 folder, which is right here. Of course, it's not on my right-hand side yet. I need to move it over, so I'm going to move this whole folder. So I'm going to upload that. Now my Lab 10 is on the right-hand side. I'm just going to double-click that so I can make sure that the files are in there. And I'm also going to copy the location of where it's at. Remember that we are clothing.php, so I'm copying that information, and I'm going to go out to my browser. So I'm in my browser now, so I'm going to go out to my web space. Now, if we did everything right, it should show up. So here is our H1 that we put in, Clothing Lab 10. Then we have, if we look at this, let me just make this a little bit smaller so we can see this and the code at the same time. Here we have our while loop, and our while loop is saying echo out the words clothing item followed by what that clothing item is. So clothing item, and there is that item, followed by color and the color of that item, and it should go through each and every one of the items within our database. So it's giving us the item, the color, the price, and the tax. Well, what if we want to order this in a particular way? We can sort it, and we can do that in our code as well. So let's go back here to our code, and I'm going to add another SQL variable line after this one. And to do that, because I know I'm going to be putting another line here, I'm going to put a space after that price ID, and then after the semicolon, I'm going to click enter, and I am going to create another variable. And it's also going to continue to be SQL. We're going to concatenate it in, so it's a period and the equal sign. Quotations. We are going to use the SQL query called order. Order is exactly that. It's how do you want it ordered or sorted. So we're going to say order by, and then we need to select something of how we want to order it. And I think the first thing I want to try, because we're going to try a couple of them just so you can see the difference. The first one I'm going to do is try it by the item type. And so I would take the table alias, the period, and then the column name. So it'll be order by c.item. That's all we need to put as far as if that's the one we want to use. And then we need to determine if we want to use what's called ascending or descending. We're going to say we want to order this by the item name in ascending order. I need to make sure I put a semicolon here, and then we're going to save it. And I'm going to go back out to FileZilla, and we're just going to re-upload this clothing.php file. Let's go back out to our browser. I am going to click refresh because this is from when we originally did it. I'm going to click refresh. And now it is in ascending order by item. So we have an item here that is polo shirt, sweatshirt, t-shirts. That worked. So let's see if we instead want to sort by color. Let's do this by color instead. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep this order by, and I am changing this part out, and we are going to change it to this col.color because that's what we want to change it by. I actually just copied it and I'm pasting it in right here. We're going to do a file save on this document. I'm going to go back out to FileZilla, re-upload, overwrite, go back out to our browser, and I'm going to click refresh. And now you can see that it's sweatshirt, polo shirt, t-shirt, etc. But it's sorting by color. So it's black, we got all the blacks, then we got blue, 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 then we go to green, gray, pink, red, and finally yellow. So that is how we use the order function. So what we've done here is we are selecting data from what is referred to as a relational database. What we've done, first of all, just as a really quick recap, we have gone in and created the code, or in this case, we copied it from our previous code, but we're connecting to our database. If it fails, kill that connection. If it works, then it's going to display the rest of our page. We opened up our HTML and displayed one piece of content here called Clothing Lab 10. And then we opened up our PHP again and we made a SQL statement. And our SQL statement says select the following columns, item, color, price, and tax from their respective tables, but we start with from the clothing table. Then we join in by using an inner join our next table. And our next table in this case happens to be our clothing colors table. Then we do the same thing again and we do an inner join again, but this time we bring in the clothing price table. Finally, we order it, and what we ended up with in our result was we ordered it by the color name that is listed in the color column. We queried it. We said if the query doesn't work, then display an error. Otherwise, else. If it does work, create this while loop. And in the while loop, create an array out of the result and display our items by echoing them out. That is what we are doing. We used an inner join to create a relationship between our tables and display it in one place on a web page. Hopefully this will help prepare you for your case study this week where you're going to be doing something very similar. Good luck.